First up is going to be Ryan and David. They're at Opower. They're both designers. Told me there's about 8 to 10 designers there, and at least half of them surf. What are the odds that the 2 who came tonight are surfers? Pretty good. It's not.
Hello? Can people hear me okay?
And me.
Perfect. Right. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks everybody coming out tonight. This is actually a really great turnout. And he was right, we do surf, but not very well necessarily. It's a little more arm flailing and laughing at each other. But I'm Ryan Devenish.
And my name is Dave Royer.
And we are both designers at Opower. And we've been there for about 3 years now, getting there. Just a show of hands, how many people have actually heard of Opower? Surprisingly, way more than we expected. So I don't know how much you all know about Opower, but every day we wake up and come to work, and our mission is basically to try to motivate everyone on Earth to conserve energy. And I'd like to share just a quick story about how we got started. So about a decade ago, a leading behavioral scientist, Dr. Robert Cialdini, he set out to essentially answer the question about what would make people use less energy. And he started asking people these questions, and he was trying to find out, like, why is it important to them? What are the different things that they would actually respond to that would get them to save energy? And the 3 things that emerged for them was, one was about saving money, which makes a lot of sense. Another one was about just generally helping the environment. And then the third one was about being a good citizen. And these were all reasons that they brought up to him. And so what he did was he was trying to find out which of these 3 was going to be like the most impactful for people. So the idea that he came up with was to print out door hangers. Each one had one of these messages on it, and each one he went around to thousands of homes across Southern California and put them on various doors. And the idea was that over some time, I think over the course of about 2 or 3 years, that they would then come back and look at and see which one of these messages had the biggest impact for them.
Help people save energy.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I can just get a show of hands. Who here thinks save money was the one that really did it? We got a couple here, quite a few. Okay. What about the one in the middle? Save the planet? Okay. What about being a good citizen? Quite a few. Okay. You guys ready for the results? Well, none of them really worked. So pretty interesting, right? They actually all had about the same impact. It was almost nothing. So, but he tried one more, and the interesting thing about this is the idea he tried was nothing that anybody told him. The one he tried was basically, your neighbors are doing better than you. Your neighbors are saving energy, are using less energy than you. They're using their fans instead of their AC, and this message actually caused people to save around 6% of their energy. So when Opower was first getting started, the big idea here was, how can we apply this to everybody? How can we take this experiment and roll it across the entire world? And that is essentially what we're doing today. Does anybody recognize this? Does anybody actually receive one of these in their home? We got one back here, quite a few actually over on the right here. So 6 or 7 years later, we send these reports to millions of homes all over the world. And we're essentially running like the largest behavioral science study that's ever been conducted. And what we're doing is we're using normative comparisons to compare people to their neighbors. And you can see there with like the 3-bar chart there, we're just showing generally what the norm is for people. And these results have actually been really amazing in conserving energy. So to date, we've saved around, actually a little bit over, I actually checked this morning, it's about 4.1, I think, terawatt hours, and around $475 million on people's energy bills. And I know that like terawatt hours doesn't really make a lot of sense to a lot of people. So 4 terawatt hours is essentially the equivalent of what the Hoover Dam produces every year. And all of this is through just motivating people to change. Since then, we've actually developed and launched many other products, and each one of these is using behavioral science in various ways. And these are all around, again, just trying to get people to save energy.
Great. So before we go into our products, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by behavioral science. So there's a lot of different definitions. There's a lot of people taking on from different angles. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with BJ Fogg, a local guy. And then the Dan Ariely books, Predictably Irrational, are really famous. But at Opower, we've basically defined it as the body of knowledge about how people really behave and why they behave the way they do. So to talk about behavioral science, I'm actually going to talk about 3 different studies and the behavioral science behind them. So the first one, which some people might know about, I think is in a couple of the Dan Ariely books and in Freakonomics, I believe, has to do with the daycare study. So in this study, daycares in Israel were having an issue where parents were late picking their kids up from work. So in a given week, there were 7 parents that were late to pick up their kids from daycare. So they thought, hey, is there a way we can get people to pick up their kids on time so we can go home? The people at the daycare didn't want to have to stay late every single day. So they came up with like a pretty simple idea. They added a late fine. Every day that you were late to pick up your kids from daycare, you paid $3. Pretty good solution. The surprising part is once they put the fine in place, the number of parents per week that were late actually rose to 20 parents per week. So it totally backfired on them. So it's an unusual finding that adding a fine actually increased the number of late parents. So what is the behavioral science behind this? Why would this happen? How behavioral scientists explain this is the idea of social norms versus market norms. So this is the idea that in some parts of our lives, we follow social norms. We do the right thing because it's what is socially expected. So in the beginning, people weren't late to pick up their kids because you don't want to inconvenience the people that work there. It's the reason you might help someone fix a tire on the side of the road or do a favor for someone. It's not about money, it's just about doing the right thing. But once you introduce money into the calculation, which they did here, they put in a $3 fine, which is essentially a price, then the parents have a different mindset. They think in their heads, is it worth getting an extra hour of my day back for this $3? And for a lot of them, the answer was yes. So it fundamentally changes the way they viewed the situation. And the weird part is once you get people in this economic mindset, it's hard to go back. So for this particular study, he then removed the $3 fine. So they said, this isn't working, no fine. If you're late, that's fine. Just you don't have to pay money anymore. And the number of parents that were late stayed at about 20 per week. So it never actually went back down. So once people are in that economic mindset, then they're just thinking, oh great, it's $0 to be late. This is even the better deal. I'll be late all the time. This isn't a big deal. So if you think about the implications as a designer or as a researcher, the big ones are just, as soon as you motivate someone with economic means, economic ways, it fundamentally changes how they think about the entire situation. So just be careful. If there's ways to motivate them socially, it's often more effective and lasts longer. So for the second study, it's about happiness and dating. And this is a pretty simple study. They just gave a bunch of single people a survey with 2 questions. The first one is, how happy are you? 1 to 5. And the second one is, how many dates have you been on in the last month? So the good news for all the single people out there is there's no correlation. Whether you've been on 0 dates or you've been on 20 dates, it's the exact same happiness level, which is great, which kind of makes sense. That's just a small part of your life. So they did it again, gave it to another group of single people, but changed one thing. Exact same questions, but this time they asked first, how many dates have you been on the last month? And then they asked, how happy are you? And this time, strong correlation. The more dates you've been on, the happier you were. So it's an unusual finding. First asking about the date numbers actually affected their happiness. So why is this? What is kind of the behavioral science reasoning behind that? The first one is people are primed to think about dating. As soon as they brought up the concept of dating, that's what people is on their mind. And what behavioral scientists call the focusing illusion overvalues dating. So because it's what's currently on their mind, they actually overvalue it. And Daniel Kahneman, a pretty famous behavioral scientist, he has a quote I really like about this that is, nothing in life is quite as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. And that totally holds true. So they've actually been able to replicate this exact experiment, but with asking other questions. So they ask, how's your job going? How happy are you? And there's a strong correlation. But if they flip the order, there's very little correlation. Whereas, how's your relationship with your family? And how happy are you? And by asking the family question first, there's actually a strong correlation. So whatever they're thinking about, they actually overvalue in their happiness. The other reason why this happened is what we call the attribute substitution. Happiness is a complex question. There's a lot of different inputs that are put into it, and it's hard to call on the spot, what really makes me happy, what is happiness? So essentially people are using the first question as a proxy, unknowingly, and actually using some of that value towards the happiness question. And I think the big implications here are mostly for research. One thing we see a lot at Opower is when people come in and we talk to them about their energy use and how they're saving and how they're not saving, they will tell us things like, oh yeah, I totally care about my energy use, or I think about it all the time. But really, it's just focusing illusion. They've been talking about it for the last hour. So right now, they think their energy use is the most important thing that they have to talk about. But as soon as they go home, the kids are crying and they have to cook dinner, and I think that whether or not they leave their AC on is not, at the top of their priority list. So I think there's a lot of interesting implications for user research. The final study I'm going to talk about, to kind of talk about some behavioral science points, is a soup sale. So a grocery store had a sale on soup. And it was a good sale, so good that the average customer that came in that day bought 3.5 cans. So everyone who came to the store bought some more, some less, but the average was 3.5 cans. And then they made one change. They added a 10-can limit. They had a giant sign above the soup that says maximum 10 cans per person. And if you think about it, this shouldn't really change much. No one's really buying more than 10 cans in the first place, right? They're buying about 3.5 for the most part. So this shouldn't change anything, but it did. Once they put the big sign above that says 10-can limits, the number of soup purchased per customer actually doubled. So it's also a pretty unusual finding, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first one is anchoring on 10 cans. The idea of anchoring is something that you see affects a later decision, even if it's unrelated. There are studies they do where they ask people to come into a room and bid on an item, like how much are you willing to pay for this shirt? But with one experimental group in the lobby, before they even go in the room, they're in a lobby with a big poster that has a big number 99 on it. Totally unrelated to the study, it's a piece of abstract art that has the number 99. Another group is sitting in the lobby and there's just a big number 1 out there. And they're looking at that the entire time. And they actually find the people who were in the room with a giant 99 bid higher on that number, or on the item, even though it's totally unrelated, just something in their brain has anchored on a high number versus a low number. So that's the first reason, is just seeing that number 10 actually anchors them up higher on soup. The second one is herding around the amount of soup to buy. Buying soup is something that, what is the right number of soup to buy or acceptable? Is it 1? Is it 10? If you have a lot of cans of soup in your basement, are you like a weirdo? It's a very unclear social space. So having a sign that says limit 10 can per person signals to people that, hey, there are people buying 10 cans of soup or more. They have to stop them from buying more than 10 cans, telling people it's acceptable to buy a good number of cans of soup at one time. And the last one is just around scarcity. Usually limits are in place because they're afraid they're going to run out. And there's like a scarce amount of the resource at this price. So it just signals to people this is a really good deal, which increases sales. And I think all three of these are actually really ripe as design concepts and something we use a lot at Opower. And you see things like scarcity all the time with limited betas or invite only to apps. Or there's that mailbox app a couple years ago where there's a waiting list to use an app. You're using their app and you have to wait to use it. So things like that add value. It tells people this thing is so good that they can't even let everyone use it at once. So that's one way you see scarcity kind of used in marketing for tech apps. So those are 3 different studies that kind of show some fundamentals of behavioral science. Now I'm going to quickly walk you through 2 Opower products that Ryan and I work on that use behavioral science. So the first one is around getting people to use less energy on peak days or the hottest days in the summer. And we'll pay them for each kilowatt hours they save. So utility companies generally want people to use less energy on hot summer days. That's when they're at their peak demand. They can have brownouts. No one likes brownouts. So they're like, is there a way we can influence people to get them to use less on really hot days? And hey, we're even willing to pay. So we said, sure, we'll help you with that problem. And as we were working through it, we actually came up with 3 separate solutions, which we are A/B testing. And so pay attention, because I'd love your guys' opinions on which one of these you think is most effective. So the first solution we tested just says, congrats, you earned $8.75 for earning 7 kilowatt hours, or saving 7 kilowatt hours. And this gets sent the day after the peak day. On the left side here, we show how much they typically use and their use on that day to explain where the 7 kilowatt hours came from, but it's really just about the money they earned. That's the main motivating factor here. The second one is financial end comparison. It shows how much you earned on that peak day, but then it shows how much everyone else earned on that peak day. So if you remember what Ryan was talking about earlier with normative comparison, so this tells people, hey, I earned money, I did the right thing, but the average person is even doing more of the right thing and even earning more money. I want to be like them, I'm feeling left out. The third version we tested is just energy comparison. So although they're getting paid, we don't really bring that up in this version. We just talk about the amount of kilowatt hours they saved versus other homes. And if you remember the daycare study we talked about a little bit ago, once you bring money into the equation, it changes the way people think.
And I'll ask you to repeat the question, and then
Sure.
we like to run around.
Sure. So the question was, what was the demographic of the people we interviewed and what was the economic situation? So it was actually the entire city of Baltimore. So it was pretty much everyone and a wide range of economics as well. Yeah. For the different versions? I'm going to hold on for 1 second before people vote, but that's a good question. So this is the third version, and as we were talking about earlier, why we chose not to include dollar signs on here at all is because as soon as you bring in money, it changes how people think. So in the previous version, they only earned $3, and other people were earning $5 or $7. But as soon as people get in that economic mindset, they often think, hey, I only made $2 less, and it was a super hot day, and it'd be really uncomfortable to earn that extra $2. It's only $2, like who really cares? Where this one, where it's more abstract terms, it allows them to see, hey, I'm doing worse in other homes, but not rationalize it away with cost. So those are the three versions. There's the financial one, where we just talk about how much money they made. There's the financial in comparison, where we talked about how much they made and how much other people made. And then there's just energy comparison. Who is doing more of the right thing? So by a show of hands, who thinks financial was most effective in getting people to save money or save energy? All right, we got 1 or 2, perfect, 3. How about financial and comparison? Do people think that was effective in getting people to save energy? And then how about energy comparison? All right, so energy comparison seems to be the winner. And unfortunately for you guys, this is the second trick question of the day. The study is going on right now, so we'll have results by the end of the summer. But we are as excited as you are to find out the results, probably more so. And one other thing I wanted to bring up is, with behavioral science, we use behavioral science to kind of frame this entire experiment. But behavioral science is actually really valuable when you're working on the details as well. So let me give a quick example. So in this program, I showed you what they received after each peak day. But before each peak day, we actually robocall them. So the day before a hot day, the utility company will call them and saying, hey, this is Baltimore Gas and Electric. Tomorrow's a hot day. Could you turn down your AC? You'll get paid, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of each one of those robocalls, of course, you have to include, to opt out of savings day notifications, press 9. But as Opower, we don't want them to opt out. We want them to stay in because we want to notify them about the next peak day and have them save energy there. So we racked our brains of like, hey, are there any behavioral science mechanisms we can use to get people to not opt out? And one interesting piece of literature we came across is that people just fundamentally hate closing off options. Even if it's an option you don't really want right now, just saying you never have the option to do it again is actually very scary for people, that permanence and that loss. So we just added in the word to permanently opt out of savings notifications, and it just gives people that twinge of doubt, like, maybe I will want to hear this annoying message later in the summer, even though they're not particularly into it right now. So I just want to give that a quick example of how including behavioral science in all levels of both high-level thinking and details is pretty valuable. The last product I'm going to talk about here is the thermostat sign-up flow. So we want to encourage people to set their thermostats to an energy-efficient temperature. So for the summer, that would be as high of a temperature as possible, and this is just a wireframe. So we'd want people to have a temperature closer to 80, less closer to 60. So I'm just going to discuss a couple different behavioral science strategies we're testing to try, kind of move through these quickly. The first one is changing the default. So instead of having the default of 74, have the default of 78. And this is effective because A, people are lazy and don't always change things, but B, having something as a default suggests that it's kind of a norm. The company that put this out is the expert on what people set their thermostats at, so just having it the default is kind of is telling people in a subtle way that this is the normal thing to set. A similar example is changing the range. So when they hit the drop-down menu, instead of showing 70 to 77, you can show 73 to 80. And these are subtle things, but over a large sample size, you'll see the differences. The next one is recommendations. Tell them which temperature is recommended for them based on what they've told you so far as the expert. Another approach is labeling efficient homes, which similar to what Ryan had talked about earlier with the normative comparison. Just let them know what other people are doing, and that often changes behavior. And these are all ways that we can change their behavior on the dial itself. But prior to the page where they actually set temperatures, we have another page where there's a bunch of questions and preferences about their thermostat and their home that we use. And on this page, there's actually things we can do that we think will change their temperature or making them more efficient on the next page. So one is check all that apply to your household. We want to be a little warm in the summer to save money on our bills. So if they check that, we would give them a little warmer default temperature. But the great thing about this is even if they don't check that, they read a little warm in the summer to save money on our bills. And we've just primed them to think about the relationship between their bills and the temperature they've set. So even if they don't check this, all of a sudden, we had talked earlier in the example about the dating, all of a sudden top of mind is, wow, there's like this relationship between the temperature I set and my bills, and right before they go into the page where they actually set the temperature. Another thing we could do on the page before is have the reasons why you want to keep your house cool. The nice thing about this is there are people who have very legitimate reasons for wanting to keep their house cool. And we should stop bothering them and pushing them to have it as efficient as possible. But the other interesting thing about this is if your only reason is comfort, and you check this one box out of 30, you might think twice about, do I really need to keep my house cool? Or are these other reasons like much more legitimate and I only checked one? And a similar example to this that we really like is Dan Ariely, the famous behavioral economist, has a class, he teaches a college class at Duke. And I think everyone remembers at the end of college classes, you rated your professor. It like went back up to the university and they got tenure based on it or not. It was like a part of their performance review. So what he did one day is, before he got that official review from Duke University that his students filled out, he told the students, before you fill this out for the university, first help me. I want to make this class better. I'm going to give you this sheet with 10 empty slots. Tell me 10 ways this class could be better. And you know what? Even classes you hate, you probably couldn't come up with 10 things that are wrong with the class. It's just off the top of your head, you just don't have that much recall. But because the number of open slots were 10, and because he asked for 10, people kind of filled it out, and then they're like, oh, I guess this class wasn't so bad after all. And when he did the study, the people who got that, as opposed to just filling out the class survey, gave him dramatically higher grades in the class. So those are some examples of how we use behavioral science at Opower. And Ryan's going to provide some tips of how you can incorporate behavioral science in your design process.
Yeah. So I think the first one here is like a little obvious, but it really comes down to you really just have to learn the science. There are lots of really good resources out there, and you can't really begin to apply these techniques without first like understanding all the reasons why people react to them the way they do. And books are a really great starting point, and don't worry, we actually have a whole slide of resources at the end, so we'll get to that. But books are a great starting point, but it can take a really long time to like internalize all that and really make these insights like useful to your everyday like toolkit. So so those are great, but we also recommend like taking some classes. Dave just mentioned Dan Ariely. He has got a really great Coursera course, which is actually free. It sounds like I see some head nods there. Somebody else likes it as well. They're really engaging, and he's just like a really great storyteller as well. And we've actually opened up these things to a lot of people at our office, not just our designers. And a lot of people have really felt that these are engaging and insightful for them as well. And one of the other things we really enjoy doing is like we've created a discussion club at the office. And this is another thing that we've really opened up to the whole organization. So we include PMs and engineers and business units and all this stuff. And it's a really great way to like question and answer, like really share all your knowledge and borrow from other people as well.
And as Ryan was mentioned, one thing we found is reading the books are really interesting. Like the stories I just gave are interesting stories. And then when you read them, you're like, aha, yeah, that makes sense, that's cool. But it's really hard to internalize them and use them in your everyday work. So something like this discussion club where you're actually explaining to other people concepts and they're explaining back to you and you're building ideas off each other seems to be a really good way to actually make it more part of your process.
Absolutely. So one of the best times to incorporate behavioral science in your workflow is when you're like beginning, when you're first starting to come up with ideas. And one method that we've just used before is like a really simple one. It's just creating a simple matrix. And you can see like we have a list of all the different types of behavioral techniques on the left here, and then across the top our potential goals or like potential features that we have. And each, you can have like a group of people or even like personally by yourself, just brainstorm around like where two of these meet and just trying to come up with as many ideas as you can that could support applying herding to a game-like experience or whatever you might have for yourself. There's also lots of other really helpful tools out there. We really enjoy Steven Anderson's mental note cards. This is like a really nice deck of cards with like these really cute illustrations or whatever, and they do a really good job of explaining all the behavioral techniques out there. And then some of the other ones that we have as well, Dan Lockton's Design with Intent Toolkit. This is actually something that you can like download tonight. It's free, so you could actually start using them right away. Or you could even make them yourself. These are actually a couple of different cards that Dave made at his last job.
And one thing that's kind of interesting about this is we do it with our design team, but then we also involve product managers and developers in these iteration or ideation sessions. Because the nice thing is we give each person a card, and then we're working on a new feature, and then using that card, try to apply that behavioral science to the feature to improve it. And then we go around, everyone shares out their card as well as their design ideas. And it's a great way to come up with ideas. In general, everyone is just really interested in these behavioral science principles, even if you're not a designer. And then the other great thing is you're getting buy-in early in the process. So anyone who's involved in that ideation session is more bought into the design throughout the process.
Yeah, it can be really fun and interesting for everyone. So in the next part, when you're like trying to improve your ideas, when you're critiquing them as a team, one advantage we've found of really understanding the science behind all these techniques is that we're actually a lot better at giving feedback. We find that we have like a common language that we can like pull from, and we're actually able to like reference different studies, like that door hanger experiment that I talked about earlier, and it gives us an opportunity to like just really share something and really dive into the details. So yeah, and just that idea of like, again, we have this common language that we can share throughout the whole organization. Another one that feels a little out of reach, possibly for a lot of people, is really just getting an expert. For ourselves, we actually share a lot of our work with Dr. Robert Cialdini, who wrote Influence, and he's actually like a big backer of Opower and has helped us along the way. And being able to do this with him is actually really awesome for us because he's just an expert in the field and he can provide all sorts of valuable feedback for us. Like I said, this might seem a little out of reach for everybody, but social scientists are really hungry to work with like real life experiments, and a lot of them are like kind of trapped in academia. So there might be someone in the room right now. And so you can kind of make a partnership with these people, and they're like willing to run like real tests with you and help you kind of develop these studies, and you're kind of getting backed by them, and they might even write up papers or whatever that are kind of backed by their university as well.
And the other great thing is they're just much more tapped into the newest research. So if you're sharing a design, they're like, oh, there's actually this newest paper that came out of this place this time, and they can lead you in the right direction because that's their whole life, which is really great.
Yeah. So in the next part here, when you're going out and doing usability studies or having people in your office, one of the things that you really need to like look out for, and like a really common pitfall for a lot of people, is that they're actually asking, what would you do in these various situations? And that's actually like, that's expected in usability studies. That's pretty common. But when you're designing for behavior change and when you're using behavioral science, what we say and what we do is so different. A lot of like the experiments that we were just talking about earlier like really illustrate that. So when you're doing usability studies, you can't test for persuasion. You have to just test for comprehension. And so what we really have to do is just make sure that your users are understanding what's going on. In fact, we actually see all of this like very odd behaviors all the time at Opower. Regularly, people are telling us that they don't care what their neighbors are doing. They're telling us that they're not swayed by any of the things that we're putting in front of them. But in practice, this stuff actually works, and it's very, very powerful.
Yeah. And going back to some of the examples earlier, I mean, one thing that you always hear is that financial is the best way to motivate them. Everyone's like, oh, if you just gave a reward, that would motivate me.
Yeah.
But when you actually look in the real world, there's a lot of better ways to motivate people other than financial rewards that both last longer and then don't change them into the economic mindset. So what people say in these studies should definitely be taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah, you can really only test behavioral science in the wild, or at least when people are feeling like they're in their natural setting. And that essentially leads me to the next tip, which is you really have to launch your product as soon as you can. And this is the only way that you're going to gather like meaningful results. And when you're actually launching it live, that's great, and you can run A/B tests, but of course, that can be problematic. So one of the things you can think about here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be your live product. It doesn't have to be the thing that's out there in the wild. You can run just prototypes. They just have to feel really real. What I mean by real is like you just have to simulate their personal environment. So you can imagine like the paper reports that we were showing earlier. If we printed those at the office where we work and we like stuffed the envelopes ourselves and it was on our own printer at the office or whatever, and we sent it to you all, we could still get meaningful results from all of that. So again, it's just about like seeing people in their natural environment as much as possible. And again, about watching what people do, not what they're saying, because those are usually at odds. And then the next piece of this is that when you want to do research, you want to find out the why. That's when you're pulling in field research and trying to understand, well, why did I get those metrics? Why did people start to download my software more or do something different that you didn't expect? And that can be useful for you to go back and like look for opportunities to improve the product.
Because the metrics alone, like we'll see people save energy, they don't save energy, and that tells us which design is successful. So we like this one won and this one didn't.
Yeah.
But going out in the field and actually seeing how people live and how they interpret the design can give you some clues of why it worked and allows you to iterate and make the design better for next time.
So with that, we hope that this is all really useful information for all of you and that you guys can start looking for opportunities to incorporate behavioral science in all of your projects. Thank you very much.
We'll save questions till the end.
Sure.
Okay. Kelvin, do you need to? Boy, that was great.